It starts with a rumor and a spark on a winter night, a flare on a remote pipeline in Siberia, or a false return on a radar scope, or a cable that suddenly goes quiet in a sea no one visits. Without a reason. No vaner headlaun. No public claim of responsibility. Just a series of small failures that come not from whether or where, but from design. In Washington, a handful of officials stare at a map that is really a set of arteries, oil and gas lines, rail corridors, microwave relays, undersea cables, power grids, and see not geography but leverage. Somewhere in Paris, a file changes hands. In Ottawa, a software build number is quietly rewritten. In a North Atlantic listening post, a technician marks a pattern that isn't. The plan that connects these dots has no single author or code name. But to the few who watched it take shape, it felt like a ghost, present, uncredited, and designed to pass through walls. The aim was simple and ruthless. If the Cold War turned truly cold, the West wouldn't just fight armies. It would quietly unmake the systems that kept the Soviet Empire breathing. Tonight, we go inside that ghost protocol, a constellation of export controls, deception, operations, network mapping, and contingency sabotage plans that never appeared on a podium but helped bend a superpower's confidence until it cracked. Some details remain classified or contested. What follows draws from memoirs, declassified directives, public hearings, and the historians who have spent careers separating legend from method. We won't tell you how to break anything. We will show you how nations thought about it and how close the world came to learning those lessons the hard way. Part 1: The battlefield beneath the map. Cold War strategy classes often begin with missile silos and end with treaties. But the battlefield that mattered most wasn't the one that glowed on satellite photos. It was the one that hummed. The Soviet Union's reach depended on long, exposed lines, the Druzhba oil pipeline snaking west, the Baikal-Amur mainline extending rail across empty distances, telephone trunks and microwave relays feeding commands from Moscow to military districts, radar nets linking Arctic horizons to command bunkers, power grids stretched across climates that punished mistakes. Soviet planners knew this. So did their adversaries. And by the late 1970s, after Vietnam and détente, after Afghanistan and a decade of economic slowdown, the West began to ask a question that made generals uneasy and intelligence officers smile. In a crisis short of nuclear war, what would it take to make the lights flicker at the right time in the right places without firing a shot? The answer was never one thing. It was a playbook that grew by accretion, written in overlapping hands across Allied capitals and executed by people who rarely met. The name we use tonight, Ghost Protocol, is an analytical label, not an official code, but it captures the essence. A plan you carry in pieces so that no one person can read the whole. Part 2: The Farewell Dossier and the Birth of a Deception. The modern chapter opens with a walk-in. In 1981, a mid-level KGB officer named Vladimir Vetrov, codenamed Farewell by the French, handed over a trove that landed like a thunderclap. His files mapped Line X, the KGB's global effort to acquire Western technology. Through legal purchases, front companies, and theft, the dossier was extraordinary in scale and specificity. It showed who was buying what, where, and for whom, from computer controls to industrial metals to machine tools no Soviet factory could yet match. French President François Mitterrand shared farewell with Ronald Reagan. In Washington, CIA Director William Casey and a small circle that included economist Gus Weiss proposed a twist that would enter Cold War folklore. If the Soviets are stealing, give them what they came for: tampered. Not manuals that always fail. Not gadgets that explode on contact. Tools that work just well enough to pass initial tests, then degrade. Software that behaves under normal loads and then, at a moment of stress, introduces confusion. Components whose tolerances are technically within spec until they aren't. One claim in particular haunts the mythos. In his memoir, At the Abyss, former Air Force Secretary and Reagan advisor Thomas C. Reed wrote that a Soviet gas pipeline exploded in 1982 after Moscow acquired, via Line X, Western-made supervisory control software, doctored to misbehave, allegedly through a Canadian firm. Many historians consider the story plausible but unproven. Russian archives are silent. Some contemporaries doubt the scale or even the occurrence of a massive blast. What matters for our purposes isn't the fireball. It's the policy. Use the enemy's appetite for Western technology to seed doubt in the very systems he thinks he's strengthening. This was not sabotage in the cinematic sense. It was logistics turned inside out. The policy sat on top of a broader regime, the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, CoCom, that denied critical tech to the Warsaw Pact. Farewell added teeth. Where you couldn't deny, you deceived. And where you deceived, you logged what went where. In a future crisis, that ledger would matter. Part 3. The Economic Front and the Siberian Pipe. Infrastructure is never just mechanical. It's political. In 1981–82, the Kremlin pushed to build the Urengoy-Uzhgorod pipeline to ship Siberian gas to Western Europe, a project that promised hard currency and political leverage. The Reagan administration tried to stop it, sanctioning equipment and arguing that Europe would become dangerously dependent on Soviet energy. Allies balked. The project moved forward with domestic substitutions and workarounds. But the fight clarified a doctrine. Pressure the USSR where its economy is brittle, particularly in energy technology, software controls, and finance. That doctrine reached beyond petroleum. Export controls tightened on machine tools that cut. High-performance alloys, tools necessary for missiles and turbines alike. Western suppliers were told to watch for end-use fraud. Shady middlemen found their worlds smaller and more dangerous. Cases still sealed in archives likely describe shipments that never arrived. Boxes that triggered inspections at the wrong moment. Machines that worked then drifted out of tolerance under loads they were designed to meet. Again, not explosions. Friction. Part 4. Under the sea on the wire. If you plan to break infrastructure in a crisis, you need to know it first, its routes, redundancies, rhythms. In the early 1970s, the U.S. Navy launched one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the Cold War. In the Sea of Okhotsk, inside waters the Soviets considered their backyard, U.S. submarines located and tapped a buried military communication cable. The project, known publicly as Ivy Bells, produced recordings of high-level naval communications for years. It was not sabotage. It was theft of silence. But the method, mapping and accessing a critical artery, would form part of the ghost protocols. Anatomy. Know the skeleton well enough and you know where to press later. The tap ended when John Walker, a U.S. Navy warrant officer spying for the KGB, betrayed. Soviet divers recovered the device. The artery healed. The lesson stung both sides. For the Soviets, your most secure lines are not. For the Americans, operations that touch infrastructure are political nitroglycerin. If they're burned, they burn you by name. Part 5. The Stay-Behind Shadow. In Western Europe, another layer of contingency sat waiting for a war that never came. NATO countries maintained stay-behind networks, civilian military cadres meant to act if the Warsaw Pact invaded. Much about these efforts remains controversial, particularly in Italy, where gladio became a byword for conspiracy. But stripped of politics, the mission profile was clear. In an occupation, sabotage what matters: rail lines, bridges, depots, relay nodes, so that supply convoys choke and communications splinter. Western planners assumed the USSR had similar plans for Western infrastructure. Both sides understood in the first days of a land war, small teams with explosives and wire cutters could shape outcomes more than tanks. Part 6. The Electronics of Deception. By the 1980s, early computers ran industrial processes the way conductors run orchestras. The acronym SCADA, Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition, had not yet entered. Dinner table conversation. But services thought about it. Western engineers who studied. Soviet systems understood their strengths. Rugged hardware, redundancy, men who could coax miracles from parts a Western plant manager would bin. They also understood the bluntness, less flexible software, centralized control, a premium on compliance over creative. Troubleshooting. If you wanted to hobble such a machine in a pinch, you wouldn't throw a brick. You'd tweak a sensor so it underreported stress until it didn't. You'd delay a valve by a fraction until a pressure wave found a weak seam. You'd do so in a way that looked, in grief, like maintenance gone wrong. This is the part where responsible storytelling requires restraint. The point isn't which parameter could do what. The point is that planners imagined it. Policy reflected that imagination. And after farewell, the West knew the catalogs Moscow was shopping from. Part 7, The War Scare and the Edge of Miscalculation. In November 1983, NATO ran Able Archer, a command post exercise that simulated a nuclear release sequence with unusual realism. In Moscow, KGB Center already feared a Western first strike. Operation Ryan tasked residentiers worldwide to look for signs of impending attack. The exercise looked too plausible. Soviet intelligence alerted leadership. Nuclear forces went on higher alert. The war scare eased without catastrophe. But the episode stamped a warning on the Ghost Protocol's playbook. Sabotage and deception live in the same neighborhood as miscalculation. A software glitch could become a crisis under the right political weather. Any plan to inject doubt had to be paired with ways to cool it. Enter hotlines, backchannels, and tripwires. Quiet arrangements proliferated. If you see X on your radar, call me before you escalate. If a cable goes dark, assume a trawler, not a torpedo. If a gas line loses pressure on a day with no wind, check the compressor station. First, none of this was formal. All of it was human. The Ghost Protocol depended on adults at desks who understood that the job in a crisis was to buy minutes. Part 8. Directives and Discipline. Reagan-era national security decision directives codified pieces of this posture. NSDD 32, 1982, emphasized measures short of war to contain and pressure the Soviet Union, economic, political, and clandestine. NSDD 66 sharpened the energy front. NSDD 75, 1983, outlined a long-term strategy to compete and win, not just contain. None of these were manuals on how to break a pipeline. They were blueprints for a campaign that treated Soviet infrastructure as both vulnerability and lever. Export controls, technology denial, covert influence, and economic warfare became strands of a single rope. Within the intelligence community, another discipline hardened, chain of custody in deception. If you seed a flawed technology, track where it goes. Don't let a rumor run free. Attach it to a sensor you can read. If you push on a system, know who will feel it, civilian, military, or both. Avoid lines you cannot defend to yourself in the quiet. The post-Watergate legal architecture, oversight committees, covert action findings, forced blunt questions into rooms that prefer romance. Do the ends justify the means? Will our people be able to say so? Later, under oath. Part 9. The Contest of Engineers. While the West practiced denial and deception, Soviet engineers fought back with competence honed by scarcity. They swapped domestic designs for Western part numbers. When sanctions bit, they invented workarounds in field conditions. They hacked their own machines. If a controller drifted, they tuned it. If software froze, they found a rhythm that made it behave. Their toughness raised the bar for sabotage. It also created fragility. System tuned by genius can be brittle when the genius retires. Soviet counterintelligence adapted, too. The KGB's Directorate T, the counterpart to Line X, tightened tradecraft. Customs checks grew nastier. Western businesspeople found themselves under surveillance that felt personal. Sometimes paranoia paid. Sometimes it missed the point. The most dangerous West European in the room was often not the spy. Was the salesman. Part 10. The Case That Wouldn't Die. Return to the 1982 pipeline story. Reed's account remains one of the most cited and most attacked. Skeptics ask, where is the crater? Where is the satellite imagery, the State Department démarche, the Soviet protest? Proponents respond, the Soviet state hid industrial accidents as a reflex. Western satellites saw what they saw and filed it under code. Words not yet public. The scale of the explosion in popular retellings may be wrong, but the essence is right. Some archival hints exist. Canadian intelligence officials recalling quiet briefings. U.S. documents acknowledging a deception effort against Soviet procurement. Definitive proof, photographs, intercepts, is either classified or non-existent. What we can say with confidence is narrower and still striking. Western policymakers, acting on farewell, directed a program to manipulate technology flows to the USSR, including delivering flawed designs. Whether that program produced a spectacular fireball or a series of mundane failures, the intention was the same: make Soviet planners doubt their machines. Part 11. The end that wasn't an ending. The Cold War closed without a sabotage spree. The red flag came down over the Kremlin because of internal contradictions and external pressures that accumulated for decades. Stagnation, Afghanistan, oil price shocks, arms race burdens, nationalities in motion, a state that could mobilize steel but not trust. Did the Ghost Protocol help? It likely compounded costs at the margins that matter in long contests. Denied machines, delayed production runs. Deceptive software, 8 months of labor. A network mapped by adversaries could be targeted. In a war that, thankfully, never started. If you're looking for a single blow, you'll miss the point. The utility of such a plan is not the headline. It's the hesitation it induces in an opponent who stops believing in his tools. Part 12. After the curtain. History didn't end. Changed names. In the 2000s, a worm called Stuxnet silently spun. Iranian centrifuges offbeat and taught the world that code could cut steel in ways spies had imagined a generation earlier. Scholars drew a line back to farewell, to the doctrine of deception, to the idea that an adversary's procurement channels are both veins and vulnerabilities. The line is instructive and dangerous. Part 13. The Ethics of Invisible War. When is covert disruption legitimate? Democracies answer with law and restraint, or they cease to be democracies. The Ghost Protocol relied on export control regimes approved by legislatures, on covert action findings read by representatives sworn to secrecy, on allies who could say no, on professionals trained to see civilians in the picture, not just targets. Also relied on secrecy, the kind that makes public consent aspirational. The tension remains. A policy that treats pipelines and grids as fair game in a crisis must assume reciprocity. What you can do to another, another can do to you. The counterargument is grim and pragmatic. In a contest between systems, the least bad form of violence may be the one that dents machines while sparing bodies. If sabotage short of war keeps a war from happening, the moral ledger looks different. But that if is a cliff. The same shadow that hides a tool hides a miscalculation. Able Archer's ghost sits in the room. Part 14. What was written, what was learned. Declassified bits show the scaffolding. Export control lists that read like shopping catalogs. For a country you want to slow down. Diplomatic cables that redeemed favors to hold a shipment at a port. Minutes from CoCom meetings where allies argued about whether a 5-axis milling machine was a bridge too far. Memoranda about Line X agents unmasked and expelled, about front companies rolled up, about tradecraft adjusted. Testimony from senators and spymasters who, after 1991, began to say in public what they had signaled in private. Victory was as much the product of careful denial as it was of open competition. Veterans of those years, when they talk off the record, sound less like hawks than mechanics. They remember part numbers. They tell stories about crates that arrived with one bolt subtly wrong. They talk about trust in allies, in lawyers, in bosses who let them say no to a bright idea that would have felt good and done harm. They don't sound like people who wanted to break things. They sound like people who wanted options if the breaking started. Part 15. A map of arteries then and now. Imagine a map with its colors turned off. Lines only. In the 1980s, those lines made a human shape with a Soviet heart. Today, the lines thicken and tangle, gas to Europe, fiber to the world, power interties satellite constellations. The Ghost Protocol's principles: know the network, pressure the seams, deny the keystones, build the backchannels, survive. But the audience is larger. The bystanders are all of us. A sabotage that once could be contained to a lonely step now could ripple into the phones in our pockets. The hard lesson the Cold War bequeaths is not how to sabotage. It's how to imagine the costs before you touch the map. The best operations are the ones you prepare and never use. The most responsible victories look like nothing happened. Part 16. The Human Clause. Every plan hides a clause written in a font too small to see until you need it. It says, someone will sit at a console at an ugly hour and make a decision the plan can't. Someone will tell an ally the truth before it's comfortable. Someone will stop a shipment, write a memo, take a vote. Someone will say, hold. The Ghost Protocol depended not on wizards, but on adults, a coalition of the boring. Engineers who love tolerance charts. Customs officers who love paperwork. Diplomats who love sentences that make it through translation. If memoir and archive teach anything, it's that those people saved us as surely as any missile defense or brilliant speech. They kept a doctrine designed to slow an adversary from accelerating a catastrophe. Part 17. The debate that never ends. Even now, scholars argue the weight to give the ghost. Some insist the USSR fell of its own contradictions. Western tech denial and deception were background noise. Others contend those measures eroded key capacities, delayed pivotal programs, and undermined confidence. The truth lives in the middle. Sabotage plans did not topple an empire, but they taught the empire to mistrust the tools it had stolen. They bought the West time in a contest, where time mattered more than zeal. The caution: don't confuse narrative elegance with proof. The dramatic story, the explosion, the ruined pipeline will always beat the memo about a software patch. But history is mostly patches. Part 18. The Last Quiet. There is a scene, unverified and yet convincing, that belongs here. In the late 1980s, a Western liaison officer visits a counterpart in a neutral capital. They drink coffee that tastes like meetings. They trade hints and assurances. At parting, the counterpart says, if the day ever comes, leave our hospitals alone. The liaison nods. Leave our kids' lights on. That's what it means to carry a ghost protocol and a conscience in the same briefcase. The Cold War ended with more archives than answers. We can trace the contours of a plan that aimed to sabotage Soviet infrastructure if necessary and to slow it beforehand. We can see how it worked: denials, deceptions, maps, and manners. We can see who it depended on: engineers, diplomats, and a few brave men like Vetrov who decided to tip scales with paper instead of bombs. We can also see what it risked: miscalculation, reciprocity, and the corrosion of trust that makes restraint possible. If there is a single thought to carry forward, it is not about the ingenuity of sabotage. It is about the discipline that kept it in its place. Power, at its wisest, is the ability to interrupt without being seen, and the judgment to decide again and again not to. The next time a headline flatters us with calm, consider the hands that stood between design and disaster, between what could be done and what should be done. In the end, the Ghost Protocol's most enduring lesson isn't how to turn off a rival's lights. It's how to keep your own on without losing sight of what they are for.